All right. Hi, Christine. Well, hello, everyone. I'm really excited for our resilience panel today. We have a really very well-rounded and very well um, experienced panelists, round of panelists to talk about their research with mammals and how they interact with resilience in their research, and talking really about how resilience ties into their conservation work as well. Um, oh, that's a good question. Do panelists prefer if the cams of the audience are on or off? Is there any general sense? Whatever folks prefer. Okay, yeah. So feel free to turn your camera on if you want to interact. But today we're gonna start with a few introductions for our panelists, and then transition to more of a Q&A. And before that, I'll kind of lead in with a few kind of seeded questions. So I'll hand it over to our panelists. Maybe we can start with brief introductions of who you are, where you're calling from, and a little bit about the research you do and the species you work with. So maybe Quasi, do you mind starting us off?
Yeah, sure thing, Kendall. Hello, everyone. Thanks for showing up on well, wherever your time zone is. Thank you for showing up. And I'm really excited to chat with you all about the work that we do and how we think about resilience. So my name is Kwasi Rensford. I'm a postdoctoral scholar at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And What other information should I include, Kendall? Like the full like bio or just the current?
Uh, you can get maybe not like a full bio, but it would be good to give a snapshot of like the kind of work you do and especially like the kind of species you work with.
Yeah,
That'd be
yeah,
great.
okay.
Yeah.
So currently my work's mostly focused on mammals, obviously, but in particular how mammals are coping with climate change and how climate change is affecting their distributions on the landscape. My current work is focused here in Western Canada. So I have a project here in British Columbia and in Alberta, looking at how bobcats and coyotes are the two projects, looking at how their ranges have been shifting northward as the climates have been getting warmer and what factors are influencing those range shifts. So things like how they use habitat, what their habitat preferences are, and how they respond to stress and novel situations. For Before being at the University of British Columbia, I was a graduate student at University of California, Berkeley, where I did similar questions on climate and range shifts and behavior. But instead of focusing on big carnivores, I was focusing on small, tiny rodents. So I was working on chipmunks in the Sierra Nevadas, studying similar questions, but focusing a bit on things like exploration and boldness and stress and some other behavioral questions with them. And yeah, I'm originally from the Caribbean. I've kind of lived all over. And yeah, I'm really excited to talk to everyone today. So thanks for having me.
Yay. Great. How about Jaya? Do you want to go next?
Hi everyone, I'm Jaya Clark. I am a second year PhD student at the University of California, Santa Cruz. There, my research right now is about classifying land cover change over indigenous Tanzanian villages. Currently, I'm not working with any non-human mammals, but there is time for that to be explored in this research. However, I did complete my master's last year at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, working alongside the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. There, I utilized and managed a camera trap network across 3 states in the Northeast to measure mammal occupancy as it's affected by forest management techniques, in particular, one being resilience. So, um, I have lived all over the US, but currently I'm in Santa Cruz, California. Thanks.
Great. Fantastic. Cesar.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cesar Estienne. I'm calling from Oakland, California. I'm currently a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. I'm also an urban ecologist for Second Nature Ecology and Design. And a lot of my research thinks about how inequity and injustices shape the ecology of cities on larger scales, but also more finite scales with mammals. So I think about behavioral changes in coyotes and raccoons in cities, and how that kind of varies with different factors on the landscape.
Okay, and Mukami?
Hi everyone, it's good evening here. So I'm calling in from Nairobi, Kenya. I'm excited to be on this panel. I think I'm the only one not doing any current research. My name is Mukami Ruoro, Dr. Mukami Ruoro. I am a wildlife veterinarian. I work with the Kenya Wildlife Service, and that is the government body that's mandated to take care and protect Kenya's wildlife for Kenyan people. So I currently work in field situations, any kind of field interventions, whether it is translocations, rescue and rehabilitation, treatment. I do a lot with different kinds of mammals, and I'm happy to be on this panel and to talk about one of my favorite mammals. Thank you.
Fantastic, great. So I think before we start talking about, how resilience interacts with ourselves and the species we work with, I think it's important to establish and think about what kind of the conservation threats and concerns and stressors are, because that's really what's interacting with that resilience. So maybe we can go around again and talk about, in the systems we study, what are the biggest conservation kind of threats or concerns for the species or ecosystems we work with, and how you kind of interact with that. And let's just, unless someone wants to go first, we can do the same wording. Okay, Kwasi.
Yeah, happy to stick with the same order. So my the species that I work with, so I studying how they respond to climate change. Climate change is gonna affect everything in some way. But the species that I work with in particular, I think, have their own unique sort of risk factors under climate change. So my current work on the coyotes and bobcats, these species aren't like particularly at-risk species. They're widespread, common generalists, and they're poised to do pretty well in the future as habitats are altered and as climates change. What's really important to know then is how these species are going to be moving across the landscape, how they're going to be colonizing habitat, and how that's going to kind of reverberate out into ecosystems as the climate continues to change and as these species assemblages reshuffle. In particular, large carnivores have a unique potential to have disproportionate effects on their ecosystem because of their position on the trophic network, right? These like higher levels on the trophic network, they can have an outsized effect on other species in the ecosystem. And then it also makes them a lot more visible to humans in terms of conflict and coexistence. And so understanding how those species are going to be moving across the landscape as the climate changes is going to be really crucial for how we as people and how ecosystems in general are going to adapt under climate change. My other work with chipmunks up in the mountains, that's much more of an acute risk in that mountain species or mountain ecosystems in general are going to be some of the most sensitive and vulnerable to climate change, especially in the coming decades. Mountain ecosystems are very, very tough places to live in. There's very narrow windows of time where animals can carry out essential functions when there's enough heat and light and warmth for plants to grow. And so any disruptions to those like really delicate balances of timings of climatic events, the timing of important ecological and biological functions, any disruptions to that can have really drastic effects. My two chipmunk species that I studied in my grad school were hibernators in particular, and hibernating animals are going to be really at risk under climate change as changes in temperature change the timing of when they go to sleep, when they wake up, what food's available when they wake up, how much food they can get to build up the weight that they need so that when they go back under to hibernate, they have enough resources stored up to survive the winter. And so, yeah, there's a lot of unique challenges for the animals that I study in different ways. And yeah, it makes it a really interesting and important question to address.
Thank you, Kwasi. That was really interesting to listen to. I was also relating heavily to the work that I did in my master's. So utilizing camera traps in the Northeast, my master's project, I decided to focal in on only 8 species of forest species. So the Northeast in particular are particularly the Northeast is particularly affected by climate change. The Northeast is projected to have a rise in temperature 2 degrees faster than the global average will. The Northeast is home to a lot of invasive species through colonization over time. The forests there have been heavily timbered and logged, so there's a heavy biological legacy that's surrounding the Northeast in particular. And so climate change is an added disturbance multiplier in a way. So these forest species, in particular the mammals, I was analyzing how they would be interpreting and interacting with the changing environment due to forest management. So we're working alongside the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change multi-regional project. There's a base site in the Second College Grant of Dartmouth in New Hampshire, and there they're utilizing 3 forest management techniques. One's being resistance treatment, where the forest plot stays practically the same to hone in again the biological retention of that forest plot. How can it do on its own? Then the mid-transition point is a resilience plot, and so this was my introduction to resilience and this concept, which is not always how I now interpret resilience, but resilience in forest management in this context is allowing some change, but ultimately allowing a biological history to continue. So that's for forest managers, maybe introducing some new species, but also reintroducing species that had left the ecosystem. And so the third treatment style is a transition experimental design, and that's where forest managers will allow a complete transition to what we think will be the target or ideal for what will be in that climate. So in the Northeast in particular, of the Second College Grant is within this ecoregion where boreal forest meets Acadian hardwood forest. So the species there are particularly at a dilemma. You know, we're at the southern edge for boreal species. So if we're projected to climate to warm, species in the Northeast are to move northward and poleward. These species are already at their edges limits. And then we're also having a rise in general list species such as coyotes and black bear, which for the people around is actually a little bit of a detriment, but I'm seeing a rise in those species at that transition point. So my camera traps were particularly interested in moose. That's a large species in the area, also at their southern edge. So another big issue surrounding moose in the Northeast has to do with ticks. We're seeing a rise in moose ticks, and that's causing a large decline in the moose population, particularly to their calves. So moose was a large animal of interest. A second interest going down to small was the red squirrel. So red squirrels are great indicator species of a forest's health. So my camera traps were able to pick up quite a lot of little squirrels that come up and say hi into the camera. In addition, another species would be fisher, martin, flying squirrel, white-tailed deer, I said coyote, moose, and bear. So thank you so much for listening to that. As a concern for Northeast species. Now, my PhD work, thinking about the conservation concern in particular for indigenous folks in Tanzania, in particular for wildlife in Tanzania, is changes in conservation plans. So my research now is assessing how indigenous conservation is impacting the landscape there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was great. Yeah. Cesar, do you want to talk a little bit about what you are working with in conservation concerns and threats for your species and ecosystems?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think I'll focus a bit more on like ecosystem things. And so, yeah, I think when we think about cities at large, one of the main factors I think that create conservation concerns in city is just different forms of injustice and inequities within cities, such as like the racialized sightings of highway locations or other pollution sources. It's because these inequities and injustices can kind of end up shaping the biophysical landscape that both animals and people are experiencing. So things like pollution, where trees and vegetation go, the quality of that vegetation, the amount of impervious surfaces in that area, and the resulting heat from that. And other forms of differences in resources that ultimately create more healthy ecosystems for some people and less healthy ecosystems for other people, which also affects the type of animals that can exist there, and how healthy that they can be. And so some of my work has looked at how redlining in California, so this policy in the 1900s that denied access to credit and other financial resources based on race or ethnicity, shows that those redline neighborhoods in California have heavier pollution burdens, they have more noise, and have elevated temperatures, and they have less vegetation. And so as a follow-up to that work, we also found that those same neighborhoods in California also have a lot lower levels of biodiversity across multiple groups, including mammals. Then these neighborhoods also have these smaller, kind of more distinct pools of wildlife, which means that some of those neighborhoods are subjected to these really harsh environmental pressures. So more pollution, more noise, and so on, also hold some really unique species. And so to overcome those disparities and to conserve species and biodiversity within cities, you have to think a lot about environmental injustices and how to center social justice to kind of overcome all these differences in pollution and how that has these downstream effects on biodiversity within cities.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm glad we have such like diverse perspectives of different kind of conservation threats and concerns. This all worked out well. Mugami, do you want to add for your region as
Yeah.
well?
Yes. So the species, the mammal that I picked to talk about today is the eastern black rhino. So this is one of my favorite mammals, just because anytime I think of resilience, this is the mammal I think about. And I can't do it justice without giving you a little bit of background. They're currently critically endangered. And their numbers had been in steady decline. So in the around the 70s, 60s, there were about 20,000 in Kenya. And then they declined almost over 90% to about 400 individuals in the 80s. That's around 87, 88. And this was because of poaching and many other factors, culling because of agricultural land way back in the 60s. But then slowly from the ban of the trade in the horn, slowly over the 90s, from like 92, they began to steadily increase in number. So they have a lot of threats. Most of the most important being, or the most pertinent that everyone knows, is poaching for their horn. I mean, Chinese medicine, and in Asia, in Middle East Asia, they use it also for other things. So that's the first and foremost challenge they face. But also, what we are getting to understand right now is that we are decreasingly having less space for wildlife in general. Populations are growing, and so space for wildlife is reducing. And the black rhino has not been left behind with this. So currently, Kenya has about 80% of the eastern black rhino population in the world. And they're all in protected areas. And then some of the other threats they face is disease. We've had anthrax outbreak in national park here in Kenya, and that affected some black rhinos. We also have climate change being one of the heaviest threats to the conservation of the species, because we constantly see prolonged periods of drought. And this comes with its own challenges. It brings about loss of browse, habitat degradation, sorry. And then we also have livestock incursions into the protected areas, because herders are looking for, and communities are looking for pasture and browse. So there's a lot of threats to this species, but as we continue to talk, I'll let you know how resilient we are.
Yeah, thank you for that. And yeah, I think this really helps set the stage for what we're going to talk about for the rest of the panel, and how resilience kind of intersects with these stressors, both for the wildlife species, but also the people that are performing the work. So I have one more question I'm going to cede to the panel, but the audience, please think of questions or like curiosities that you have, and you can either put them in the Q&A in the chat, or I mean, if the panelists are open to it, you can like raise your icon hand and we can call on you to ask that question as well. But my question is for the panel in any order, and feel free, whoever wants to speak to this can. What does resilience mean to you? And how does that, I guess, yeah, how is resilience important in the fields and regions that you study, and how is it really being leveraged? Kind of philosophical, but that's what we want. Too heavy?
Could I go first?
Yeah, no, it's open to anyone.
Awesome, because as I was saying before, I was introduced to resilience as as a treatment method for forest management. So originally, to me, it's the perfect in between. It was explained to me, and this is not exactly what I think anymore, but explained to me as more as being resilient. It's just enough that we could survive, and we're surviving great, and you can do well without changing too much. And so that is what I thought for a forest, and for a forest, maybe for a tree that only needs water and sunlight and air. Those three things are perfect, but surviving is not enough. So resilience to me, and so we have also, just to mention, we have ecological resilience, where we have these states of changes in states. And so I'm coming to terms with that a little bit, but for an ecosystem, that's possible to change from one state to completely to another. Social structures also have the ability to change. I feel like in social structures, we see that happen a little slower. We see a resilience in methods. As a person, philosophically though, there is just all disturbances aren't the same disturbance. So trying to scale and calculate how much disturbance a person can take, it's not not where I am in the framework of my life anymore. So resilience is how can we keep going and even be better, not so much as be what we used to be. How can we take what has disturbed and what we had before and move forward to be in a state of ideal? And so that a little bit is what resilience means to me.
I really love that. Cesar?
Yeah, I think I mean I think at like face value that resilience is about like persevering through adversity, and I think that moves like across a lot of different scales. I think people are resilient within their own homes, right? Through like harsh family or roommates. I think folks are resilient in their institutions when they're facing different forms of like sexism, homophobia, list goes on. And across populations when folks are being resilient to integrated forms of like racism and classism. And I think resilience to me necessarily includes the conversation of community and connections, and using that power to kind of be resilient in yourself. And I think resilience is super, super prevalent in cities and in the Black community in particular. I think that comes in many forms of things like food justice, right? Providing space and education for folks to grow and reclaim their food. And I think in Oakland, where I'm based, right, a huge example that a lot of people are familiar with resilience is like the Black Panther Party, right, in Oakland, who they were resilient and kind of defended their neighborhood and community from things like police brutality by having neighborhood patrols. They bolstered resilience by doing things like providing free breakfast for community. They opened a school. They had free medical clinics. All these forms of resilience to kind of remove themselves from a system that was really toxic and hurting their community. And so, I think resilience here within cities and other systems is about kind of hopefully creating a safer future that protects the collective futures of everybody and not just one person. And that is through pushing through exposures to environmental hazards, over policing, and other forms of like disenfranchisement, exclusion, racism. Yeah.
I think I can go next. Yeah, so for me, resilience, to me, resilience means bouncing back. So I take it as there's all these setbacks, there's all these challenges, even adversity, blocks, whether they're real or perceived, but you bounce back from this situation, you bounce back from this events. And for me, relating it to the Eastern Black rhino, like I said, there's a lot of challenges that the animal goes through in their environment. And I mentioned a few. But I think I also mentioned that all of these animals, I forgot to say that right now we have about 1,004 individuals in the country. So they bounced back from their 400 in number in the 80s until the 1000s now. I said that they were in protected areas. So I like to think of it as they're in protective custody. They get watched over every day. There's aerial surveillance, and there's all these tech gadgets that help us check if they're doing well. And we also have rhino monitors on the ground who actually are the boots on the ground who check on them daily and weekly. And it's as though we give them an environment. We give them not the perfect environment, because there's other species involved wherever they are. There's the things I talked about, like livestock incursions, there's climate change, there's diseases, there's predation even of their young ones when they give birth. But there's all this adversity going on, and they were given this place to live in, and they decided to thrive. And that's how I see it, as they were not given the perfect situation, and they had been through a lot of adversity, but they bounced back, and they're continuing to bounce back.
It's okay if I jump in, Gimbal.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I love all the diverse responses that everyone had for resilience. I think it really shows how complex a topic it is. I think that complexity is like very central to the work that I do, thinking about sort of the kind of distinction between, and I think this came up in a lot of our answers, the distinction between sort of this individual resilience that I think is more intuitive to us, like, right, like individuals coping and dealing with adversity, versus the resilience of systems, right? So like particularly like thinking about ecosystems under stress, whether it be through human disturbance, climate change. And I feel like and a lot of my work and a lot of kind of what keeps me up at night is trying to figure out how to like how do we bridge that individual resilience to the system's resilience, and do the things that make an individual resilient, or do those actually scale up to making systems resilient? I think that's still a very open question in a lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that folks are doing. And yeah, I think, and particularly in the context of climate change, I think resilience has is kind of the topic at hand. You know, I think we've gone past the point where we're going to prevent climate change. So now I think we're very much at the point where we're going to have to figure out how to adapt to it. And so thinking about how people are going to adapt to it and how animals are going to adapt to it are some of going to be the biggest questions of the next few decades. In my work in particular with the chipmunks in the mountains, resilience was always like forward in my mind, thinking about as the temperatures are warming, as growing seasons are getting longer, as the years are getting drier, like how are these animals going to find the resources that they need to do the things that they need to do? How are they responding to stress in their environment? Do species with healthy and growing populations, do they also seem less bothered by stressful situations? Do those individual resilient individuals, does that track with having a healthy and growing population under climate change? And so those kind of questions have really motivated me a lot. And then in my current work, thinking about, okay, so we do have a bunch of very resilient individuals in coyotes and bobcats, these very flexible and adaptable species. Okay, so how is that going to look under a changing climate? How are they going to affect other species in their ecosystem? Like, does having these big populations of resilient individuals, does that then lead to these more resilient systems? So that's kind of my sort of thoughts about, or how I think about resilience.
Yeah, these are all great. And I really appreciate kind of the nuanced discussion about kind of the different levels of resilience, because that's also something I think about a lot too. Like, does does resilience scale up like from its components, and how do we build more resilient ecosystems? Like, where do we start in doing that? And more resilient communities. I think, yeah, a lot of these big stressors that we're thinking about kind of take a systematic approach, and not just like thinking about the resilience of the components, but like a real kind of change in the paradigm and framework of how we think about the ecosystems, kind of like what Jai was talking about, where it's not just like surviving, but actually like adapting and thriving for like what the future's to bring. And I think, well, I would be really interested to hear if like people have examples or anecdotes of either like species or like cool behaviors or examples of communities that are kind of being resilient to the stressors we kind of talked about. I don't know, like coyotes or chipmunks, like not being out in the heat. I know that's what what's bad quasi, but yeah, just some specific examples. And then also how those, maybe if they did inspire like how you kind of perceive yourself and resilience, and how you are not resilience, but like how you carry yourself either as a scientist or like personally.
Kendall, I just want to flag, it looks like we have something in the Q&A.
Oh, oh. I didn't realize. Wow. Oh, there's a separate Q&A chat. Okay. Here, let's ask that one first. So, Quasi, in terms of behavior, why do you think coyotes are adapting so well? Oh, wait, I think this might be for, well, it might be for Cesar, but for anyone. So in terms of behavior, why do you think coyotes are adapting so well to urbanization and anthropogenic threats as opposed to other canids?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think I'll offer like a little bit of my understanding, and then I'll punt it over to Cesar. So, you know, the Shell Lab, that's what they've actually been focusing a lot more on in the urban setting. But yeah, I think for a lot of species like coyotes, I think behavioral flexibility goes a long way in making you adaptable to a very novel and unpredictable environment. So there's a lot of different axes through which you have to like kind of be adaptable and flexible to make it work in these environments, right? You have to be able to make use of novel food sources. You have to be able to identify and avoid novel risk factors. Your physical body in a lot of ways has to adapt to these new conditions, whether it be like the pollution Cesar mentioned, or the new nutrient composition of the food you're eating. So there's a really multi-dimensional suite of things that has to happen for an animal to be able to thrive in such a novel environment. And that's why we only see such a small selection of species that really seem to thrive and do well in these kind of urban environments, because it's such a unique, and it's so many different pressures acting at once. But yeah, Cesar, I'll punt it over to you, and you can talk a little bit more about the work y'all are actually doing.
Yeah, I think what a lot of Kwasi said is correct. I think in terms of like a summation of knowledge, I think that's still missing of like what exactly about coyotes makes them really, really adaptable to cities. But I think part of it has to do with their behavioral flexibility and just plasticity. They're really, really, really flexible animals. I think also a huge part of it is that they function as this like top predator in ecosystems, so they're able to like exert pressures on other animals like foxes and speculatively like other mesocarnivores like raccoons and possums. And so in those areas, they're able to like outcompete them, and lead to like some spatial differences in like habitat and like who's actually settling there. Yeah, I think if I haven't mentioned, I think their diet is a huge part of it too. They're really able to like readily access and exploit like human resources. I think on the flip end, in cities they're also on this really interesting line of like they can do all those things and be successful, but also they're coyotes and people are a bit scared of them, and so they also can get villainized, and there's this huge social component that kind of shapes their niche within cities and where they can exist and what they can't do. I think San Francisco is a really good example of that. I think California at large, where they have an evict coyotes movement in LA, for example, is really interesting. But yeah, I think at large, if there's like two good points, I think it's like behavioral flexibility, which like includes their diet, and also just their ability to like kind of exert these top-down pressures on other carnivores. Christy might have extra thoughts in the chat if she wants to put them, but
Yeah, that's great. And I think just on a reminder, so participants, feel free to, I now have the Q&A open, so feel free to put questions in there or in the chat and I can read them. But that actually kind of makes me think of another question, more so about kind of the connection between resilience and coexistence, especially if we're thinking about larger predators or carnivores, and even like the black rhino. What does the future look like if we're trying to do both resilience and coexistence? Is that possible? And I guess just your general thoughts of how to make that happen. And what it might look like, if anyone wants to give it a shot.
Okay, only because I can give it a little bit of shot. My master's research wasn't interested in coexistence. I worked within deep remote forests and like some landowners nearby, maybe coexistence in that terms, but really resilience was the forefront. But now in my PhD, thinking about coexistence in terms of people who live on the land who are interacting possibly daily with other wildlife species, coexistence and resilience comes up quite a bit. From other research, we see coexistence coming in terms of like time of day usage and sharing spaces with wildlife when allocated. But nowadays, thinking about resilience in the terms of coexistence, aren't they possible? Is it not possible to make the entire ecosystem resilient, thus allowing a coexistence in time and space for wildlife to engage and human activities to also engage? Possibly, but these are ideas I'm also thinking about at the moment. So I'm glad we were able to talk about it. So I'm glad to hear from the other panelists, their thoughts.
I see a question from Christine about the future of coexisting with resilient carnivores like hyenas in Kenya, especially right now. It's a tough question, Christine. I don't know. I feel like so to put it in context, we are in some part of Nairobi where I am, and there's been a high amount of human hyena conflict, and that's resulted in unfortunate deaths of human children and human adults, which is very, very sad. So I mean, I was listening to Jaya saying the way you would switch time of day and have, because generally hyenas are nocturnal, so leaving them to do their thing at night would be the best thing to do, stay out of their way. But where they stay or where they reside outside of protected areas and community line is also where people are going about their daily activities. So you have people shuffling back home from work, or kids running around at dusk, maybe going to the shop or and stuff like that. It's hard to contain human activity, especially because sometimes I think we feel like we own we own this land, we own we are entitled to our own space. But there's going to have to be a lot of education done on the ground with this particular community, and then try and figure out a way to get the this population of hyenas out of there and somewhere safe, or where they can exist for now, as we try and figure out a coexistence plan. So I don't know. I hope I've answered your question. I feel like I don't have an answer, like a clear-cut answer to it, but we are trying everything.
Yeah, it sounds like it's a complicated situation, which probably means it's going to take a complicated answer to figure out how to do that. And I think it's super relevant now because recovering carnivore populations are kind of happening all over the world. So learning how to coexist with these more resilient groups of species is kind of essential if we really care about their conservation. Do any of the other panelists want to add anything to kind of this intersection between resilience and coexistence question from either of your systems?
Yeah, I guess my like quick thoughts, I think what everyone said also is great and can apply to maybe counties and cities. I think my lasting thoughts are, I think thinking more holistically about coexistence is like the answer across a lot of different groups. I think conflict's obviously this really dynamic thing, and I think kind of taking like a two-pronged approach, really thinking about it in a more like social ecological way or just more holistic way can lead to better solutions over time. And if we know things like climate change and urban development are changing where animals are existing, what time of day they're existing, and their behaviors along with people, the behavior of people, then we kind of need both like understand these environmental changes and social changes to really solve human wildlife conflict, quote unquote, and as it keeps on being like reshaped over time. I think part of that includes a lot of different aspects like education, like Makami talked about. And I think a lot of it also thinks about centering more things like empathy and care with people and understanding like their point of view when it comes to coexistence and what they need as well as what like the animal needs within its space. Yeah, and I think even within cities, I think a huge aspect of coexistence and getting there and just kind of reducing negative interactions and promoting positive is also centering justice. If we know that along these lines of like of race and class or income, things like that, you have groups of people who are experiencing more negative interactions with certain wildlife, like pests, for example, or everything about like housing inequities in like housing structure and housing quality, or things like road differences in road infrastructure and quality, and where like water pools and things like that, which is not necessarily coyote specific, but yeah, I think it takes a larger holistic view of all of it to really think about a solution at that intersection.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Cesar on that point of taking that kind of holistic view in addressing conflict and coexistence. I think particularly kind of in my realm, thinking about climate change and thinking about how species are moving across the landscape and how the landscape is being modified. I think there's going to have to be a lot of like very difficult questions about, you know, how we use space as people, and particularly like how we share that space with our animal with our animal neighbors. I think particularly like the project that we're doing with coyotes, thinking about like how coyotes are shifting northward in Alberta. We have this huge camera data set that has that's been going since about like 2015. And sort of as coyotes are moving northward up into the boreal, they're kind of interacting with species they're never interacting with before, species that have no prior experience with coyotes. And these like kind of these reverberating effects are reordering how these species are living in the boreal forest, and in turn, I think it's causing a lot of interesting interactions with people as well. And I think it's really important to kind of have a grasp on the context of the areas in which this is happening. You know, it's one thing to kind of do outreach for urban environments, right? Thinking about like how folks living in city spaces are interacting with wildlife, and versus folks who are living kind of on the wildlife urban interface or living in rural areas. And like Cesar said, centering empathy and care about thinking about the diverse experiences and the diverse ways in which people interact with their environments. And in particular, I feel like um, the coyote example is one thing, but also thinking about in North America in particular, sort of a lot of rewilding efforts that are happening, which, you know, we all, of course, thoroughly think are a good thing, being in a resilient mammals panel. But I think those in particular are going to require a lot of empathy on the parts of researchers for folks living at the wildlife urban interface or folks living in rural areas, as these kind of rewilding efforts, or as climate change or as habitat is changing, animals are moving into spaces they haven't been before. Being empathetic to the growing pains of those new relationships with people, and you know, not necessarily discounting that. Um, and so yeah, I think coexistence is the question, but a very complicated one. I don't. It doesn't seem like there's easy answers, but it seems like there's approaches that need to be tried.
Yeah, I think hearing a common theme of like empathy and patience for each other and for like the wildlife that we, you know, share all these spaces with. We have a question for Cesar in the chat. So thinking about how certain neighborhoods are not exposed to green areas and wildlife, for reasons you explained earlier, like socioeconomic differences, redlining, etc. How do you think this affects people's tolerance and understanding of wildlife and coexisting with urban or even other species?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I've been thinking about it since I read it. I think I think it varies a lot on the person. I think it's kind of hard to make generalizations of like, you know, people in redline areas or in like poor areas generally are like less taller or maybe less likely to buy in into conservation initiatives because they experience less biodiversity. I think that's like a bit of not the right rhetoric around the situation, but I do think that from my own like anecdotal, like just like conversational experience, I feel like folks who are in these areas that they're maybe subjected to a bit more like pest wildlife feel like a bit more resilient to the idea of coexistence with urban wildlife just because they are like in ways I don't want to say like forced but pushed to maybe interact with a bit more wildlife in maybe a bit more negative ways. I think with coyote specifically, it's very difficult because I think it ranges so much of who is reporting conflict or negative interactions with wildlife and why. I think a lot of it has to do with access and belief in like institutions and if that conflict will be resolved. Um, yeah, so I think that's like maybe part of the answer to that. And I just think maybe overall, I think part of the buy-in to conservation initiatives and maybe quote unquote like rewilding initiatives in cities is exposure and education to biodiversity. I think it's hard for people to buy into things they don't necessarily have a lot of firsthand experience with. That said, I think there's a lot of really cool ethnographic work out there from like dissertations that show that, you know, areas that do have less biodiversity, there's a lot of cool buy-in or beliefs and these like other wildlife. I think, yeah, a lot of rich connections can still be poor, like just birth in these areas. I think there's a really one of our colleagues, Chase, did some really cool work in LA with coyotes and different populations of people and what they how they feel with coyotes. And there's this really great example of someone who is a homeless individual, but still has this really huge care for and connection to coyotes. I think part of that is that he sees a piece of himself in coyotes and how they're treated within society. And so I think for that reason, kind of these like clear lines are a bit variable and just like who is coexisting with wildlife, how they actually view the wildlife and things like that. Really good question.
Yeah.
Could I just say something on that?
Yeah. Yep.
I think it's so interesting. I like what Cesar said, and I agree with it 100%. Especially what I think is interesting is that it applies here as well, because we tend to see, so I'm in Nairobi, which is the capital city of Kenya, and that's an urban area, and we have urban wildlife. But I see there's less tolerance in the urban areas, and it varies. Just the way Cesar was explaining, you might find a less fortunate person who cares so much about the wildlife in his space or in her space, vis-a-vis someone who's living in the leafy suburbs. But generally, what I see in the urban areas is there's less tolerance of wildlife, as opposed to when I'm out there in the field out of Nairobi. No one really seems not, I don't want to say not to care, but it doesn't startle them when they see a lion in the vicinity, or a gravy zebra, or even monkeys. It's not a big deal. But in the urban setting, we are always being called to, quote unquote, remove them and take them back to the park. And I just find it interesting that it's the same thing across the world, I think.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, we have one more Q&A question, and that might maybe take us to the end. So we have a question asking if each of the panelists can talk about their thoughts on what the next 2 or more years would look like in their respective fields. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how resilience is kind of rolled into that as well in each of your respective projects or work.
Yeah, I'm okay going first if no one else wants to. Yeah, I think the next 2 years, I think particularly in our fields, I think historically sort of looking at the socio-ecological dimensions of the work that we do, I think was for a long time considered very extracurricular. But I think that kind of, particularly for folks engaged in ecology work, where they touch kind of the questions of climate change, habitat modification, etc. I think that ship has long sailed, and I think there's going to be much more of a premium placed on interdisciplinary work, I think, going forward. At least I hope so. And yeah, and I think thinking about sort of our work in the broader social ecological context of particularly folks who come from more sort of basic research backgrounds, I think is going to be much more standard. In particular, in addition to that, I think kind of the way we think about solutions too, I think is changing a lot. Like, I think Cesar's work and the work his lab does, I think, is a very prime example of how solutions to human wildlife conflict or thinking about how we coexist with wildlife in cities, for example, in this much more holistic way is going to be much more, I think, of the norm and much more of the expectation for solutions going forward, not so much the more kind of traditional conservation biology approach where it's like, oh, if we just build in enough genetic diversity, if we just build enough habitat connectivity, everything will work itself out. I think we're moving past that in how we do our work in our work.
Yeah, I think maybe my thought, maybe this is more of like what I would like to see in the next 2 years, maybe not what would actually happen. Is I think there will like hopefully, particularly in urban ecosystems where it's all really evidently tied together. It's just this more thinking of cities and ecosystems and wildlife within them through this like One Health EJ perspective of like what people do shapes an environment and wildlife. We know that, and that feeds back to what people do. I'm really thinking about just systems more holistically and what shapes them, which means thinking about inequities, thinking about injustices, both historical and contemporary, and really just centering the role of the human in that way, and like actually being a bit more honest with ourselves of what people can do and have done to urban ecosystems and what that means for wildlife, or even like the data that we collect and how that reinforms how we manage wildlife, how we think about biodiversity, things like that.
For me, I think I want to reiterate. I'm talking about something that I would like to see done, which is winning more space for wildlife, because I feel like that is so big here, and I'm hearing everywhere. So for me, I wish and I hope that we will be able to establish more, going back to my favorite mammal, more rhino sanctuaries, more protected areas, even for the other wildlife that we are being asked to remove from the urban areas. But I just hope that in a sense that will create more tolerance. I don't know how us as conservationists and people who work with these animals closely would do. On a day-to-day basis, we try and preach coexistence in our small way. When we interact with people, when we interact with communities. And I believe that that small interaction and how they see that we care for this wildlife will give them just a glimmer of, maybe I can live with this wildlife in my backyard, or I can live with a few pesky monkeys here and there. I just hope that in the next 2 years, this is some of the things that we'll be able to see.
I also just add on a little bit because I'm thinking next 2 years I will probably still be working on this research and studying. Hopefully, where we'll be is a more, as we said, we all have different types of consensus on what resilience is. Hopefully, that would be well embedded across all of our work, and when we have conversations, resilience will be always included. And we won't have topics regarding resilience and mammalogists. It'll just be mammalogists. And that's probably where we're headed. One of the big things that I worked on with the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center is on climate change and climate adaptation science. But one of the things that really upsets me is thinking about climate crisis and wanting to put dread on the world. If I think resilience is also a nice pathway towards thinking of how we can aid and steward and strive for a more resilient ecosystem, or one that is that suits humans and mammal needs and plants and abiotic and things of those nature. So thank you so much for having me.
Great. Yeah. I love that. And I love the hope that each of you have expressed, and hope we get there. Maybe not in the next 2 years, but eventually. Great. Well, thank you to the panelists. I'll give you like a quick round of applause, and thank you for the audience for joining and all the great questions. And we'll end there, and be sure to tune in for the last few days of Black Mammologist Suite.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Y'all, that was dope.
Thank you all so much.
Ooh.